Jessica coming up from Tulsa and Tony coming up from Oklahoma City ran through a monumental rainstorm today. I noticed on the weather tonight there are areas in southeastern Kansas that got between 9 and 10 inches of rain in the last 24 hours.
Down in Flint Hills where we were at, they got a little over 6 inches.
6 inches at Flint Hills Camp, and go a little bit farther and they got 9.3 inches. And so when it rains, it pours. Last week you took a look at Paul's trials before Felix. And how'd that go? Not the class, the trial. What's that? They were cowards. That's probably the best description of it right there. They were cowards. Yeah, bureaucracy. The Roman governors are in kind of a tough position. It's all politics, because if something goes wrong, they could very easily lose their position or lose their lives. And one of the worst things that could happen would be for the people to rebel. And so they can't let the people do whatever they want to, but at the same time they don't want to provoke them to rebellion. So they walk kind of a fine line sometimes. But it's interesting, those last few verses, what Felix does. And how does Felix respond to what Paul is teaching? Well, first of all, it scares him, which should have a different response than what he has. What Paul has to say frightens him.
Well, I think, this is my opinion, I think being frightened would be a good response if it moved us
Yeah.
toward what God would have us do.
Yeah, I agree. That should have been a good thing that he was frightened by what Paul was saying, but there may have been another factor here that was more powerful even than that, and at the same time he was interested in getting paid some money, and so that entered in. But his response is classic. I mean, we still refer to that today. His response was, in King James, "In a more convenient time I will call for you." Mine says for the present, and when I find time I will summon you. How many people in the history of the last 2,000 years have said that to the gospel? They've had an opportunity to hear the gospel. They've had an opportunity to respond to the gospel, and what they say is, "Yeah, I'll let you know. I'll call you later," and you never hear from them again. And that's really sad. And Felix was at that point of being frightened, which should have motivated him to act, but instead he just said, And he listened to him for 2 years. Can you imagine Paul preaching to you for 2 years and nothing happens? Felix was succeeded by Festus, and Felix wanted to do the Jews a favor, because that always helps in your next assignment if you leave on a good note, and left Paul imprisoned. Pretty much as soon as Festus gets there, within 3 days, what does he do? He goes up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and what do Paul's enemies do? Now, and that's my first question there. How have Paul's enemies changed after 2 years? How would you answer that question? They haven't. 2 years, they haven't changed. Now, usually people get over something. They get really upset about something, and time passes, and they just kind of mellow. 2 years have passed, and they are still where they left off, except some of them have starved to death because they took an oath not to eat until they got Jesus. But surely they were honest people, don't you think? If they made that oath, they would have stuck with it. So they were short a few numbers here, but there were still enough left. But yeah, I put that question in there on purpose to make us think they haven't changed after 2 years. That's how rabid they were.
It's kind of interesting how history doesn't, it just repeats itself.
Yeah, it's just amazing. one thing that does kind of along that line that struck me maybe today is some of the parallels between what's happening with Paul and what happened with Jesus. The false accusations from the Jews, and they couldn't do anything. We're going to see tonight that both the Roman governor and Herod, Agrippa II, are going to come to the same conclusion. And back in Jesus' trial, it says that Pilate knew or it said that Herod hadn't. Pilate told them, Herod hasn't found anything wrong with him, and neither do I. And so in Jesus' trial, they made up, trumped up charges, and the Roman governor said 3 times he's innocent. Herod said he's innocent. In that case, they went ahead and killed him anyway. This time, with God's intervention, it's a different outcome. But I was kind of interested in how, just kind of a repeat of what happened with Jesus, but with a different outcome. Festus arrives and he talked to the Jewish leaders, and it's the same. They were asking for Paul to come up to Jerusalem so that they could ambush him and kill him. That's where they left off 2 years earlier. And so Festus is in a dilemma here. He doesn't want to start out by alienating the Jewish leaders. If he starts out by alienating the Jewish leaders, it's going to be downhill from here. At the same time, he has a duty, now that he knows that Paul is a Roman citizen, he has a legal obligation to protect Paul's rights. This is a dilemma, because he cannot afford to make the Jews mad, and he cannot afford to violate Paul's rights. And so Festus told them, he's in Caesarea where he belongs, and I'll go check on it before long. Why don't some of you come up there, and you can accuse him there, prosecute him there. And so he spends another week and a half or so there, and then goes down to Caesarea. And then he takes a seat on the tribunal and brings in Paul. And then the Jews begin to make accusations, and what accusations do they make? Nothing they can prove. They just start throwing stuff out. They couldn't find anything to accuse Jesus of until somebody said, hey, he said he was going to tear the temple down.
Read verse 8 here. Paul says in his confession that I committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. So draw from that apparently that's the thing
Yeah,
they were bringing up to accuse him.
I think you're right. The fact that mentions that must mean that that's included in the list of things that they're accusing him of. Remember, the false accusation they brought against Jesus was he's going to tear down the temple. And here against Paul, they said that he had brought in a Gentile into the temple. And so there again, that same false accusation against Paul, similar to what they accused Jesus of, violating the temple, something against the temple. So here it says bringing many and serious charges. So they probably just added a whole bunch. They just take the kitchen sink and throw it at them and see what sticks. And Paul does point out that he has committed no offense against the law or against the temple or against Caesar, which is true. Now Festus still wants to be on the good side of the Jews, and so what does he ask Paul? Yeah, will you come up to Jerusalem and stand trial in Jerusalem? And Paul's no dummy. He knows what's happening. But I think Festus is just trying to get off on a good foot with the Jews. So he just asked Paul, will you go up to Jerusalem and stand trial there? And what was Paul's response? I am a Roman citizen, and I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. I've done nothing wrong to the Jews. You know that that's true. If I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But if none of those things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. He knew that it wasn't just a matter of going to Rome to stand trial under Festus there. He knew that he was being turned over to to the Jews. Festus has to check with his counsel, his legal advisors. What's his decision? He didn't have a whole lot of choice. If it was a genuine request, he had to grant it as a Roman citizen. And so they were just conferring on whether this is a legitimate request. And he said, yep, you've appealed to Caesar, so you'll go to Caesar. After several days, King Agrippa, Herod Agrippa II, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea, and they went to pay their respects to Festus. Now, who are these people? They're actually brother and sister. Great-grandchildren. Both of them are great-grandchildren of Herod the Great. And they're brother and sister. Who was Felix's wife? Who was Felix's wife? Drusilla. Drusilla was their sister. Drusilla was the sister of Festus, of Herod Agrippa II, and Bernice. There were three members of the same family. And so Felix's wife was the sister of these two, of Agrippa II. You really don't want to look into the Herod family tree because it'll give you a headache.
These two are brother and sister, and they're married.
They're not married, but they may be living together. As I say, you really don't want to. You remember that John the Baptist was beheaded because of what he did, what he pointed out was wrong, and you know there was one member of the family who was married to her uncle and divorced him to marry another uncle. It was just, I mean, this is one strange family, and so as I say, you don't want to try to follow their family tree because it'll give you a headache. Anyway, that's who these people are, the great-grandchildren of Herod the Great. Now, Felix is turning to Agrippa for help. He said, there's this guy who's been left prisoner by Felix, and when I got to Jerusalem, they made accusations against him, and they wanted me to condemn him. And so I told him that he's a Roman. I can't just hand him over to them until he meets his accusers and makes his defense. So they showed up here, and right away, I took my seat and started the trial. And in verse 18, what kind of accusations do they make against Paul? There were religious accusations. They weren't what he was expecting. I mean, he was expecting some kind of illegal. He was thinking of something serious, something real, where they would say, okay, he's done this, and then Paul could call, or Festus could call witnesses and see if they did this or didn't do that. But they're just throwing out a whole bunch of stuff at him. And he says they're just disagreement about their own religion and about some dead man, Jesus, that Paul says is alive. And so he's confused. He really doesn't understand what's going on here. He says, I was at a loss, but Paul appealed for the emperor's decision, and so I granted that. And Agrippa says, I'd like to hear that myself. And so the next day they did that. So the next day Agrippa and Bernice come in, and how do they come in? In typical Herod style, with great pomp. You remember what happened to another Herod? When he was speaking and the people said, the voice of a God and not a man. He was dressed in that real fancy clothes that probably was like gold thread, and the sun was shining off of it, and he was resplending, and they said, oh, the voice of a God, not a man. And what happened to him? He got eaten by worms. No, that would have been probably an uncle or great uncle that happened to. And so they should have heard the story in the family. But you know, they're coming in with all this ceremony and making a big deal, a lot of pomp, and all the important people are with them, and the prominent people of the city. And then they brought Paul in. And in verses 24 and 25, we have Festus's verdict. And what is Festus's verdict? Now, they declared loudly that he shouldn't live, but I didn't find anything worthy of death. But he appealed to the emperor, so I'm sending him to the emperor. I have no option but to send him to the emperor. My only problem is it's really not good practice to send somebody to the emperor without knowing what he's charged of. You know, he goes into the emperor, and somebody says, "Okay, here's the charge against this man," or the emperor says, "What is the charge against this man?" And the people with him say, "We're clueless. We have no idea what the charge is." Now, you know, we're talking. Eventually, Paul would have been during the time of Nero. Can you imagine going into Nero and bothering him by saying, "We have no clue what we're here for"? And so Festus really wanted to send a charge. It was absurd not to do that. So in chapter 26, we have Paul's defense. And first of all, why is Paul happy to be doing this with Agrippa? He's not ignorant of Jewish customs. Felix and Festus are both Roman governors, and so they're procurators. And so they may or may not be familiar with Jewish customs, but the Herods are a long line of rulers, going clear back to Herod the Great.
You read earlier about Festus and his what he did and what he thought, especially what he says, some disagreement about their own religion and a dead man, Jesus. I mean, he didn't have any idea of any of this stuff apparently.
No. Yeah.
He didn't have any idea. I think Festus, or I think Felix had an idea because of his wife.
Yeah, I think because of his wife being the same family that he probably had a more of an inside track. But Festus really has no reason to know anything about it. The Herods weren't really Jews. They were Idumean. They were related, but they weren't really Jews. Although they may be referred to as Jews, they weren't really bloodline Jews. But they were involved in ruling the country, and so they knew what was going on. And so Paul says to Agrippa, I know you're an expert in all these things, and so that's why I'm begging you to listen to me patiently. Now, how does he describe his early life? He was an upright Jew beginning when? From my youth, from the time I was a boy, I was an upright Jew, and you all know it. These Jews that are accusing him all know who he is. That's why they're accusing him. Why are they so rabid about Paul? Even 2 years later, he's not just some nobody. He's their greatest hero who has turned against them. He was their number one guy who has become their worst nightmare. And so they cannot let him go. He's not just some guy off the street.
Paul's life, he went wholeheartedly forward, whatever it was that he was doing. He was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He went wholeheartedly forward, doing what he thought was right. Not prosecuting him. He was really going at it, full force. And as a Christian, he's the same way. I mean, he's going full force forward, for Jesus, teaching Jesus, for doing everything that he can to try to bring all everybody to Jesus. And his whole life is been for that purpose.
If
He has so much knowledge, as a Pharisee, he was studying
No, they can't cope with him. If you have someone who is your best trained person, best educated, best trained person, how are you going to debate them? How are you going to disagree with what they have to say? Because they know everything that you know. Aside from the fact that he has the inspiration on his side, which makes it a very lopsided deal anyway. But they just had to hate him because of the threat that he posed to the Jewish nation. In verse 6, Paul says why he is standing trial. And why is he standing trial? The hope of the promise made by God. If you go back to chapter 24, when he's before Felix, back in verse 14 of chapter 24, he says in verse 13 that they cannot prove any of the charges. Tertullus or any of the others cannot prove these charges that they're making. I do admit to you that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers. Now, that was not an uncommon title for Christianity in the first century, was the way. That was what they called themselves sometime. We're going to see toward the last part of the last chapter, that the Jewish leaders in Rome are going to say something about this sect. And so they didn't know much about it, but they still referred to it as a sect. But here in chapter 24, Paul says that the way that they call a sect, I serve God. And what does he say there? I believe everything in accordance with the law and written in the prophets, and having hope in God. Same thing these people cherish, that there shall be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. In view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience both before God and before men. And so Paul is saying that I'm on trial for the hope that our people have always had. And now that we have it, they're trying to eliminate me. But he... Yeah. There were Jews who were Roman citizens. They could have. His parents were probably both Jews, but they could still be Roman citizens. If they were born in the right town. Well, most of the ones in Jerusalem. No, they were not captives, but they were like overrun by the Romans, under the rule of the Romans, but that wasn't the same thing. Paul grew up in a free city that was a Roman city, and so his parents were Roman citizens, or at least one of them. They were Jews, but depending on where you lived and what the situation was, a Jew could be a Roman citizen. One didn't exclude the other, but most of the Jews living in Palestine didn't have that option, because that was not an area where Roman citizens were. Being born in Palestine did not make you a Roman citizen, but being born in Tarsus, a Roman city, an important Roman city, then that gave you that opportunity. There were a lot of different levels of cities under the Roman government, different kinds of cities, different kinds of provinces and things, and he just happened to be born. I don't think it was a coincidence, but he just happened to be born in the right place at the right time. We know nothing about his parents, but I think from his description of his life, that tells us something about his parents. I don't think that all Jews know my manner of life from my youth up, which from the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Tarsus is way over, southeastern Turkey, and yet he grew up in Jerusalem and studied under Gamaliel. I think that says something about his parents. I don't think he did that on his own initiative. I think his parents did that to him and for him. So indirectly we know that much about his parents, but we really don't know anything else about them. But he's basically saying, I'm standing trial just because I believe what all Jews should believe, the hope of our fathers. and the promise that the 12 tribes hoped to attain. What was the promise to Abraham? The main one would be through his seed all nations would be blessed. There was the land promise and the multitude of descendants promise, but the main one was the all nations will be blessed through your seed. And that was passed down to Isaac, passed down to Jacob, and then passed on down to the Israelites. And so all Paul is saying is we just are finally getting what was promised to Abraham way back then, and they don't like it. And he didn't understand it then either. Because what was he doing early? He throws a little jab there in verse 8. You remember before there was a trial that didn't go right, wasn't going well, and he knew it wasn't going to end well, and he just said that he was on trial for the resurrection, and that split him. And here he just, I think, throws in a little bit of a dig there in verse 8 because he's talking about this hope of the resurrection, of God raising the dead. And so in verse 8, what does he say? Why is it so incredible for you people that God raises the dead? And then he goes on, because a lot of these people who are trying to kill him are probably Sadducees. And so he just makes that observation and then keeps on going. Every time Paul tells the story, we learn a new part of it. Earlier in his defense, he said that when Stephen was being stoned, he held their coats. And he agreed with it, that he was in agreement with it. Here we get a little bit different level. First of all, in verse 10, not only did he lock many of the saints in prison and had authority from the priests, but when people were being put to death, what did he do? I cast my vote against them. He was not just someone who was a coat keeper. He actually had the authority to cast a vote, which would make him, if not part of the Sanhedrin, at least pretty high up below the Sanhedrin, because not everybody got to vote on a deal like this. And so he didn't just agree with it, he cast his vote.
Well, then in verse 9 it says he thought to himself that he had to do many things possible to the name of Jesus.
Yeah, and that was his whole goal, because he thought that Jesus was the enemy. And he did what all the good Jews were doing, trying to force them to Christians to blaspheme. He was furiously enraged at them. He chased them to foreign cities. And that's what he was doing when he went to Damascus with full authority and commission of the chief priests. And then he tells again the story of his conversion. Mm-hmm.
So, how is it possible? They were putting Christians to death. But they weren't allowed to put people to death, right?
Sure they were. That shows you the hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders. They went to Pilate and told him that they couldn't put anybody to death, and they turned around and stoned Stephen.
Yeah, obviously they were doing this, and there was no repercussions of that.
No. And you don't see any repercussion of killing Stephen. And I think that they say whatever's convenient at the moment. And it was necessary that Jesus be killed a certain way by Roman authorities, and the Jews did not have the power to do that. But it was false that they couldn't put anybody to death, because they did it a lot. But
If you look at the law of Moses, it specified in there what they were supposed to do to people who were adulterers or blaspheme God or whatever,
Yeah.
that they were to be put to death.
And it wasn't an option, it was a commandment.
Yeah. So, even though they were under Roman authority, that was still God's law, and they were still under that law of Moses.
Yeah. And
So,
as long as it didn't cause too big a wave, the Romans allowed all the countries to practice their religion the way that they are supposed to, as long as it didn't become a threat to them. And so, yeah, under the old law, a child who was disrespectful of his parents had to be stoned. And I don't know how many times they did that. But,
Obviously, they didn't equally, it didn't equally do the law.
no.
Because there was a lot of idolatry and everything. If they'd have followed the letter of the law, there'd have been a lot of dead people.
Yeah. Yeah, they were very selective at how they applied it. It was part of God's plan that Jesus had to be killed by the Romans the way he was. I mean, it was all, and so that all worked out. And so that was fine, but it wasn't true that they don't have the power to kill anybody. I'd have a hard time convincing Stephen of that fact.
I think a lot of it had to do with their fear of man. Because one minute they were trying to get Jesus, but they were scared because the crowd loved him. With Paul, they were scared that the Romans would do something to the Roman citizens.
Yeah, yeah. You see often that the Jewish leaders want to take him, but they're afraid of the people. And so, yeah, if they can find somebody else to dump it on, they're glad to do it. And it was easy to blame it on the Romans, and then it wouldn't upset the people. Well, you get a better picture, I think, here of Paul's status, that he wasn't just some little guy. He was traveling with full power and authority of the high priest, and even carried some voting power. And then he describes his conversion, the light, the voice. It's interesting that he specifies that Jesus is speaking in Aramaic, Hebrew, Aramaic. But then it describes his conversion and the commission. And there's a promise in verse 17. We've mentioned before that the Lord tells Ananias, I've shown him the things he's going to suffer for my sake. If someone were to come to you with that type of an offer and shown you all the things that were going to happen to Paul and say this is going to happen to you, what would your response be? I think I'll pass. Because Paul had been shown the things that he was going to suffer, and he suffered a lot. It'd be enough to scare anybody off. But along with it, you see, Jesus' promise here is what? I will deliver you from these people. What is Paul's mission? His commission. In verse 18, to do what with the Jewish people and the Gentiles? Open their eyes so that they turn from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God, in order that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Isn't that a beautiful description of his commission? That he's been sent to turn people from darkness to light, from the dominion of Satan to God. Of course, our commission today is so much different than that.
We were talking earlier about how some people will go away for now, but we never hear from them again. At least they're not seeking our lives.
Yeah, no, they're not seeking the light in that case. They're seeking.
Well, they're not seeking to kill us because we tried to.
Oh yeah, no, we've done that. We've done our part. But our commission's the same today, isn't it? We have an opportunity to turn people from darkness to light, and from the kingdom of Satan to God. And so Paul says that I was not disobedient to this vision. And in verse 20, Paul gives us a little bit of insight into his what he preached after his conversion. And what did he preach?
That they should repent
they should repent and turn to God, doing what? Performing deeds appropriate to repentance. In Matthew chapter 3, when all the people are going out to John the Baptist to be baptized, some Pharisees and some Sadducees go out to seek baptism, and in Matthew chapter 3, verse 7, what does John say to the Jewish leaders? He says, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Can you imagine we offer the invitation on Sunday morning and somebody comes forward? I don't see us doing that, but John the Baptist had a little bit different insight than we do, and he knew who he was dealing with. And so what did John say to them? Basically prove it, didn't he? Bring forth fruit in keeping with your repentance. See, they were relying on the fact that they were Jews. He said, don't say just because you were children of Abraham that's going to save you. God can turn stones into children of Abraham, big deal. And so his point is, and the point of Paul's message is, bring forth fruit that shows your repentance. Repent and prove it through your actions and your deeds. And so that's really Paul's message that he preaches as he goes along. And that's why he says the Jews seized him in the temple and tried to kill him. How was Paul able to escape being killed? Help from God. Having obtained help from God, he stands to this day testifying to small and great, stating what? Nothing but what the prophets and the law, Moses and the prophets had to say. So again, all he's doing is fulfilling the prophecy. He's just saying, I'm not against the Old Testament. I'm for it. I'm finishing up where it's left off. Back in Acts chapter 10, as Paul's talking to Cornelius and the people who are gathered with him, in Acts 10 from verse 42, that God ordered us to preach to the people and solemnly to testify that this is the one who has been appointed by God as a judge of the living and the dead. Of him all the prophets bear witness, and through his name everyone who believes in him has received forgiveness of sins. And so Peter says the same thing. This Jesus is just a fulfillment of what has been promised. In fact, earlier Jesus said that he didn't come to abolish the law, he came to fulfill it. He said not one tiny stroke of the law is going to pass away until all is fulfilled. I came to fulfill it, which means that once it's fulfilled, it's going to be done away with. But Jesus was not anti-Jewish law. In fact, he was as much pro-Jewish law as anybody who ever lived. He was the Jewish law. He was the fulfillment. He was the purpose and the goal of the Jewish law. He was the embodiment of the Jewish law. So he was not anti-Jewish law. And Paul is not anti-Jewish law. Paul is helping fulfill what the law promised, because the law promised that through Abraham's seed all nations would be blessed. Without people like Paul spreading the gospel to the Gentiles, that'd be an empty promise. And so Paul just says that I haven't said anything other than what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place, that the Christ was to suffer, and that by reason of his resurrection from the dead he should be the first to proclaim light to both the Jewish people and the Gentiles. And we've noted several times passages in the Old Testament that made it obvious that the Gentiles were included, and many times when Jesus made statements that made it obvious that he was going to include the Gentiles, and yet they were so shocked when it included the Gentiles. We're so happy it included Gentiles. Paul gets up to this point where he's just saying this is what he's doing. And Festus interrupts him. And what does Festus say? You are out of your mind. What's happened to you? What does Festus say has happened to him? His great learning. He's studied too much. Your many letters, your great learning has turned you to madness, is driving you crazy. I wonder why Festus did that. I wonder why he reacted that way to.
He's trying to turn it back on him, back on Paul.
It may have gotten to the point where he was getting uncomfortable and wanted to change the direction. He may just not understood what was going on. What's that?
To the world it's foolish.
Yeah, it is. To the world it's foolishness. And that's a good point, that he didn't get it. But Paul knows this. There's somebody in the room who does get it. He's talking about fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And who's in the room that does understand that? Agrippa. Agrippa does understand that. And so Paul isn't just thinking about Festus, because there are other people in the room. And there are a whole bunch of Jews in the room, aren't there? All these people who are fighting against him are in there. And so maybe there's a hope that one of them will listen to this too. But Festus just says, man, you're crazy. You're too educated.
Well, if he agreed with him, then he would have had to admit that Christ was correct.
That's a good point. That that's a good point. Paul is making a logical presentation here. This, and this. And if Paul takes it to the natural conclusion, that means that Festus is subject, being a Gentile, is subject to what Paul's saying. And that may not be a comfortable position for Festus to want to deal with. That now it's not just those people out there, but it's me too. And that may have had something to do, other than the fact that Felix was greedy, that may have had something to do with why Felix was so concerned. And so when Festus says, you are crazy, you're out of your mind, but what's Paul's response? No, sir, I am not out of my mind. I'm uttering words of sober truth. And then he turns the attention to Agrippa. He says that the king knows what I'm talking about, and I'm speaking to him with confidence. I am persuaded that he hasn't missed out on any of these things. None of these has escaped his notice. It wasn't done. It was not done in a corner. And if your family has been around this the whole time, through your generation and your father's generation, your grandfather's generation, your great-grandfather's generation, this is nothing new for you. It wasn't done in a corner. And so Paul turns directly to Agrippa, and what does he ask him? Do you believe the prophets? And Paul answers his own question. What does he say? I know you do. Now, Paul knows what kind of a life Agrippa is living, but that does not keep him from trying to reach Agrippa with the gospel. And he tries to reach Agrippa where Agrippa is. And up to this point, Agrippa has to agree. And so Paul just focuses right in on him and says, do you believe the prophets? And he doesn't even wait for an answer. He says, I know that you do. I know you believe. And Agrippa also wants to get out from the hot seat. And what's he say? And I think the King James is a little bit misleading. It says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian, which makes it sound like I am this close to becoming a Christian. What I think he's saying is, you think you're going to convert me in such a little time? Because what it literally says, with a little, you try to convince me. And so what Agrippa may be saying is, you're not there yet. You're not going to convert me with this one little sermon. That's sad, because how many sermons did it take to convert the Ethiopian on the road? And you look at all the other sermons, and the day of Pentecost, and in Acts chapter 3, and how many sermons did it take to convince those people of the truth? One sermon. Not that we should expect everybody to respond after one sermon. That's not realistic. But it's not unrealistic for somebody to respond after hearing the gospel message, and it's a shame that Agrippa thought that this was too little, because it's pretty persuasive to me. I don't think he just didn't want to listen to it, but I think he wanted to put an end to it too. You know, you're not going to convert me with this little bit in a short time. And don't you love Paul's response? I would to God. Now, there's a difference between using God's name in vain and using it seriously. And what he's saying is, I pray to God. He's not being flippant. He's not just throwing God's name out there. He just says, I truly, sincerely would to God, pray to God, that in a short time or a long time, however long it takes, that you and everybody in this room today would be exactly as I am, except for the chains. And so his response is, I don't care whether it's a short time, a long time. I just wish everybody in this whole room, I pray to God that everybody in this room would become as I am without the chains on. And shouldn't that be our hope all the time? Wherever we are, that everybody around us would have the joy of being where we are. Paul didn't wish on them the chains, but he did wish on them the joy that he had as a Christian. And although he had chains on, you know he wasn't shackled, because spiritually he was a free man. And that's what he wished on them. Yeah. So that was his offer. So the king gets up, and the governor and Bernice, everybody with them, and they start talking to each other. And what did they say? This guy hadn't done anything even worth of imprisonment, much less death. And Agrippa gives his verdict to Festus. He could have been set free if he hadn't appealed to Caesar. Festus could not, if it was a legitimate request, Festus could not deny it. But once it's made, he couldn't undo it, because that'd be making the decision for Caesar. Once it had been turned over to Caesar, Festus couldn't intercede, because it was not his decision anymore. It was the emperor's decision, and he did not have the power to undo that. And so he says, I could set him free, but he appealed to Caesar, so that's where we go. Really unfortunate, because otherwise Paul could have been set free here. Wouldn't that have been wonderful? You don't think it would have been great if Paul would have been set free here?
See, Paul knows better. That's why he appealed to Caesar.
And I don't. It's hard to tell what Paul knows and what Paul believes. That he may not know the details, but he knows the overriding power. And so I don't know how much Paul knows about how it's going to end up. He knew before he went to Jerusalem he was going to be bound there, and he said, I don't care if I die. But isn't that an incredible faith that Paul has? I think he thinks this is a good deal. Because what does Paul do with this? He gets into the inner circles of the emperor's household. He gets the gospel into the household of Caesar. Now, Paul had said earlier, I would really like to go to Rome and see you for a while and then go on. And that would have been on his own nickel. He does go to Rome, but who pays for it? The Roman government pays for it. And so he gets to go to Rome, and he gets to preach the gospel in Rome, and he gets to get right into the inner circle and the Praetorian Guard and others that were close to the emperor and preach the gospel to them. And so I don't think Paul thinks this is a bad deal. We would think it's a bad deal. Oh, look, poor guy, he's mistreated, and he could have been let go, and he should have been let free. But in God's plan, this is really great. And it just, the last two chapters just show what happens that wouldn't happen if Paul would have been set free. If Paul would have been set free back then, chapters 27 and 28 wouldn't have happened. But you'll have to come back next week to find out what that is. Johnny?
The problem is they still haven't fixed the problem that he had in chapter 25 and verse 27. He still doesn't have a reason to send him.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what accusation he sent, because he's more confused at the end than he was at the beginning. And I would not have wanted to be him to send a prisoner to the emperor without designating what I'm sending him for. The emperors did not like to be bothered by trivial stuff, I don't think. They killed people for less than that. So I don't, that's an interesting point. He still doesn't have a solution to his problem. It'd be interesting to study history and see what happened to Festus, see how long he was around. So you have to come back next week for chapters 27 and 28. Thank you very much.